source of safety for those entering it, the source of reasoning for those who speak about it. We convey our peace and blessing to the chosen Prophet of Islam, Muhammad, and his pure progenies, and selected disciples. I would like to begin, like every other night, by first thanking the brothers and the sisters who worked tirelessly to organize the children. May Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala reward them. I also humbly ask to turn your cell phones off. And particularly sisters that are sitting those corners. I would like them to refrain from conversation until our meeting is complete. برای اینکه ممکنه زبان انگلیسیشون ضعیف باشه بعضی از خواهران یا برادران، لطفاً از خواهران و برادرانی که در اون گوشه ها میشینن خواهش میکنیم که از صحبت کردن در طول سخنرانی خودداری کنیم. Last night, I began deliberating about the kind of steps that we should take in organizing our society, and pointed out that prevailing condition, the prevailing social condition necessitates that we go through a re-evaluation of not just personal readiness, but also a critical reflection on the methodologies used to either propagate Islam or specifically with regard to Karbala issue. رجاء يا أخوات أعطوني مجال 45 دقيقة. راح تكون عندكم مجال كثير إذا بدكم تحكون ورا ما أنا أخلص. I began deliberating that the prevailing condition necessitates that not only a re-evaluations of ourselves, we needed to organize a critical reflection or have a critical reflection on the methodologies used to project the embedded values, whether in Islam or in the issue of Karbala. Projecting it to the outside world that really does not have or hardly anything in common beyond some basic humanistic principle. The Shia theological formulation as far as our Imams and the Holy Prophet clearly indicates that although the Holy Prophet of Islam took it upon himself to delineate and unpack what we call the theological foundation, but he did not have enough time within the 23 years period dividing Mecca separating it from Medina, oppression, etc., etc., hardly there was enough time for the Prophet to put it into practice, particularly in the light of what Islam considers itself to be the final message, the universal declaration and the final message that is supposed to stay for the rest of time. This is why it was necessary for the concept of imamah to follow the concept of prophethood, because the imams not only had the power or the responsibility to understand, analyze, unpack, but primarily to implement. That implementation was critical during their life. If we consider this theological formulation, and this is why most imams during their lives consider themselves to be reformers, a process by which a deviation, correction, you know the human nature, there must be a guide who is capable and qualified, so that when the social structure or people try to deviate from the path, they can be corrected and brought back. If we look at their seerah, as well as the life that they had, we see constantly they come up beyond what we call the unique historical location and contextual issues. They come up with grand theories that would explain these fundamental issues to the rest of the world. Grand theories or modalities that would explain this to the rest of the world, that it goes beyond the contextual, historical location that they were. I also stated that in the process of preparing ourselves and becoming ready in the personal readiness, there are a number of steps that we need to follow. First, rereading of the meaning of self, the way Islam and the image that Quran presents or portrays. What does it mean when the hadith says "Man arafa nafsah faqad arafa rabbah"? What kind of self are we talking about here? It's definitely not the materialistic life. There is, as I explained during the past few nights, humans are depicted in the Quran as a mix, complex realities that have material, earthly, as well as the divine spirit. So when we try to reflect or re-evaluate, reread the concept of self, we need to understand exactly what component we need to focus on. It's primarily the spiritual part rather than the materialistic part. The second step was re-education. Once we understand who we are and our responsibilities or our roles, with our cosmic roles, responsibilities that we have in the light of creation. Thank you very much. In the light of creation, then comes how do we educate ourselves, what formula we have to use to get ready. So there's re-reading of the self, re-education. And the third step was reassessment. We really need to reflect on the methodologies used. We know by now, if we believe in the faith, that Islam in general, epical events like Ashura and so on in particular, are full of inherent values that we could use to transmit to the others. So this reassessment, which primarily looks at our methodological approach, yes, sir, what the the reassessment covers the usefulness of the methodology that is being used so far, classical, worked somewhere else or didn't work, it's irrelevant. We simply focus on the relevance of these approaches to the common conditions and the prevailing circumstance. So far, we really have no analytical data that would support the argument that the, say, one of the classical approach, power, call it the passion play, or anything else, would have any usefulness in this, particularly when we move, as I said last night, there is a shorter circle, a smaller circle of the Shia community, then the larger circle of the Muslim community, and then the largest circle of the communal, the society that we live in. One of the younger brothers tonight, in the program that we have, we started from last night from 7 o'clock till about 8:45, posed this critical question. And that is exactly what I've been talking about. It shows the challenge that we are facing. He asked, what is the root of this Latmiya, Sinazani, whatever it is? And do you think that it's going to work in this country? Now, if we have failed in convincing our youth, the younger children, to the usefulness of some of these classical approaches or methodologies for convening and conveying the message, then what chance do we have when we cross the boundary into a space that has nothing in common with us? These were the prerequisite conditions: re-evaluation of the self, rereading of the self, re-education, and re-evaluation of the methodology. The personal development is one thing. Now we have to go to one stage further. Now, when it comes to trying to explain, say, using Karbala as an example, I'm going to kind of deviate for a brief moment and explain a couple of things, then I come back to my theme. Number one, there is a difference, a profound difference, between liking something and being a follower of something. In last night's Farsi lecture, I tried to explain this, that there are people that are not Muslims whatsoever, but because of the traditional way of, or the classical approach, they have a liking tendency to the whole character being presented in, say, Ashura. We have report from India, Africa, even Iran, and other places in which non-Muslims, through interaction and the interface with Muslim community, have come to understand this unique character called Hussein ibn Ali and the Ashura, and somehow a bondage, a chemistry had existed that they participate in these in these commemoration events. They are Hindu or Christian, but they commiserate with the Muslim community, and when you ask them, they look at this character for the values that are embedded in his uprising. Sometimes it's more of a sympathy for the pain that this family went through during that particular time. This is totally different from the concept what we have, where Shia is supposed to be a follower of Ahlul Bayt. So there's a different class of rational relationship. When you like something and when you try to imitate and be follower of something, these are two different bondages. Number two, this is the second issue that we need to focus upon. Islam, it's in its own worldview, explains that humans have three unique capabilities. Number one, the capability of perception. And Western literature, at least from Kant coming down, full of the debate about this human perception, part of the epistemology on how humans gain knowledge. So human perception, how you perceive things, how you gain knowledge, that's a unique characteristic to human beings. Number two, capability of making choices. Once you perceive, you decide to go either to accept one possibility or the other. This is unique to human beings. The third, the capability and the potential to implement your decision. So perception, which is part of gaining knowledge using academic narrative, part of epistemology. The second one is the choice that you make as far as which one or how, what knowledge to use, becomes part of your worldview or ontology. And then you have the power as a human being to implement those choices that you have, rightly or wrongly, into your life. Now, if we look at the literature that we have regarding all these three things, Islam links three major components together as the basis for a successful society. Number one, a successful society has to be God-centric. A society that is material-centric is not going to be successful. Why? Because it says the Islamic philosophy of creation, that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has created certain rules and embedded them within the nature. That we call it sunnatullah. These absolute rules exist. If we as human beings to recreate these primary causes, or then those events, those matters, these rules will take over. One of them, الملك يدوم مع الظلم مع الكفر ولا يدوم مع الظلم. A hadith. That power with disbelief can exist, but with dhulm and injustice cannot. The essence of power has to predicate itself on justice. It can work together with disbelief, but with injustice it's not possible. This is part of the sunnatullah. So you try to structure a power which is inherently unjust and based on injustice, it's a matter of time, it's not a matter of if that you're going to disintegrate. Corrupt powers in human history clearly is riddled with powers that have been stayed there for a few days, months, years, and then disintegrate. Bani Umayyah is one example. Bani al-Abbas in another example, historical one. In the contemporary life, colonial powers, the British, the French, the Germans, the Americans, which is tattering on the brink, and etc., etc., etc. A power that inherently bases itself on injustice is not going to survive. It's a matter of time. This is sunnatullah. This, our imams present in what we call grand narratives. if you want to succeed, if your social structure, if you really care about your social structures, number one, the first condition is you have to construct a society, an organization that is God-centric first. In your formulation of life, the first thing that you have to pay attention to is Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala and nothing else. Not my interest first, and if I have nothing else to do, well, I'll think about God's interest. This society is not going to survive. Number two is the social responsibility that we have. It's the second. Automatically there is a link. Here, where we differ with Christianity in particular regarding the concept of salvation and redemption. Christianity talks about salvation and redemption of individual as a point in a space independent of the social structure that is around him or her. You can redeem yourself. Islam says you live in a plane, in a social structure, that you either redeem the social structure with yourself or you are all doomed. The notion that you can redeem yourself, but the society sinks, this is not an idea that Islam entertains. This is why our Imams constantly talked about the social structure and how you work with it. There is a letter that Amir al-Mu'mineen wrote to Imam Hassan before he left for Safin, in which he gives him advice. He says, I read the English because I don't want to take too much time. I advise you to fear Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, O my child. Oh Lord, give me patience. I used to think that this is Colorado kind of effect. It seems wherever we go, as the Persian expression says, har kuja ki ravi aasman hamin rahe. Oh Lord. I advise you to fear Allah, O my son, or O my child, to abide by His commands, to fill your heart with His remembrance, with the remembrance of Him, and to cling to hope from Him. This is a long letter. But then around the end of this letter comes what I call Sunnatullah, the issue of the embedded laws in nature that we either learn or we pay a price. Oh my child, even though I have not reached the age which those before me have, yet I looked into their behavior and thought over the events of their lives. I walked among their ruins till I was one of them. I put myself into their position. This is learning from history. As I have explained before, for us, history is not just a narrative that you explain in books. It's a living entity that could be analyzed. The embedded laws, the Sunnatullah, can be taken out. And then we can implement these laws if we fulfill the conditions, or if we create those causes. Those laws are going to happen in our life. Nothing will stop it. Yet I looked into their behavior and thought over the events of their lives. I walked among their ruins till I was one of them. In fact, by virtue of those of their affairs that have become known to me, it is as though I have lived with them for the first time. You go back in history and live with those who lived before you, and you start analyzing their lives. What happened? to Bani Umayyah. This is why in the previous night I asked, in any analysis, it's critical as a human being, because God has given us the power of intellect, to use it. Remember the verse in the Holy Quran says, وَلَقَدْ ذَرَعْنَا لِجَهَنَّمَ كَثِيرًا مِنَ الْجِنِّ وَالْإِنسِ. On the Day of Judgment, huge number of people will deserve to be punished for what? That God gave them the power of intellect and they did not use it. So history, God has put, by the way, this is not unique to Islam. If you go back to 13th and 14th century, you see Christian theologians, but they look at it from the laws of nature, but again they talk about this issue that there are in history, there are embedded laws that repeats itself once the conditions and the causes are fulfilled. So Imam says, by virtue of those of their affairs that have become known to me, it is as though I have lived with them for the first, from the first to the last. I have therefore been able to discern the laws that exist, discern the impure from the clean, the benefit from these laws. That's number one. History has, previous histories have laws that if we want to avoid, Karl Marx has a comment. He says history repeats itself twice. Once as a tragedy, the other one as farce. If we don't want our history to be farcical, we really need to learn from the rules of history in the past. And look at, so that we will not repeat the causes. Otherwise, we will have to deal with the same consequences. The second critical issue here is the structure. The organization and structure which is needed. You see, you have yourself, you have your social structure and your responsibility towards the social reality around you, and both of you as a plane have to be God-centric, relying on Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. But structuring and organizing yourself, in chaos we will not survive. Although we have developed this knack of surviving from one chaos to the next. But if we really want to have a plan for the future, we really need to organize ourselves. Imam, again we go back to Nahj al-Balagha, was assassinated or attacked. The night, few hours before his death, he leaves a will for his two sons, Hassan and Hussein. Although directly to them, but indirectly to us. And then, أوصيكم بتقوى الله. The first thing is, I advise you to fear Allah and be God conscious. And then, أوصيكما وجميع ولدي وأهلي ومن بلغه كتابي بتقوى الله ونظم أمركم. See, this is now a general. I told you, Imam leaves a paradigm. Imam leaves a grand theory. Now, directly at the beginning to the two sons, immediately switches, includes the two sons and everybody else. That first be God-centric, bring God into your life. وَنَظْمَ أَمْرِكُمْ وَصَلَاحُ ذَاتُ بَيْنِكُمْ. Do not, and fear Allah, and you should not hanker after the pleasure of life. I advise you both, all my children, and members of my family, and everyone else whom the message gets to him or her, to fear Allah, to keep your affairs in order. An exemplary community that is supposed to stand as a shining path for the rest of the world cannot live in chaos. It's a miracle that we have survived so long. When we look at how chaotic our life is. There is no plan. Not only short, we don't have any plan, let alone short, medium, and long term. We don't have any structure and organization. نظم أمركم وصلاح ذات بينكم وإصلاح ذات بينكم, and clear the doubts between yourself. Divided, no matter how good a structure you have, you are not going to survive. Going back to the conversation I had last night, there are a number of issues that we really need to focus upon. The Imams, putting all these concepts together, number one, these grand theories teach us that we need to understand our relationship with the Almighty God and our cosmic responsibility. In the light of this divine us relationship, to be able to distinguish using our own human intellect the two paradigms that naturally come to exist based on a human way of life that chooses and implements to make material the foundation of that life, and the God the foundation of that, which naturally leads to two brands of Islam. To be able, when we move from one boundary to another, to be able to recognize that the old way of doing things may not be the right approach. And that the fact our life is transient, could end any moment. Establish some kind of a grand structure that we can return to in our life and use it as a foundation for our community. Whether it is a mosque properly organized, schools that I believe you have here. I've been told that there are schools for Sundays, particularly people who are concerned about teaching and upbringing their children, they can send it to. It's better than nothing. Whether the scholars within your community could be asked to actively get involved and develop a methodology and a plan that you engage with others. Again, these are things that are needed to do. One thing which, again, part of this notion of forgetting Allah in our life and not being God-centric is the value of life and death. The notion that death is something somehow detached, far away, that we really need not concern ourselves with it. Death could happen at any moment. If we plan, this is part of our self-understanding. If we plan for our structure, we should plan for this reality as well. Constantly be conscious that it might happen, and we should not be surprised when it comes. And one of the grand messages that comes out of Ashura is the honorable death. If the choice is between useless, dehumanized, living or existence that has no value whatsoever, an honorable death is much more preferable. Imam Sajjad, the fourth Imam, has a prayer. He says, "O Lord, prolong my death, my life, so long as I can benefit within my life for the hereafter. But as soon as you realize that my life has become a liability, and I'm not going to produce anything positive, take it." that should be the motto. This should be the principle in our life. I've already exceeded the time. Inshallah, we will continue with the conversation tomorrow night. Again, I would like to remind everyone that they say there is a school, Sunday school, that your children can go to, and I believe the boards have the necessary papers that you can send to them and register. Quickly, we want to go over the question and answer, if you have any questions. You seem to be toying with one. Go ahead.
What, in your opinion, happens to individuals who are trying to organize themselves and who are trying to integrate the structure you're speaking of, but they're surrounded by a community, a society in which, they're really the minority. What happens to them, or what should they do?
Well, let us start with the basic requirement. Islam, according to a number of verses in the Holy Quran, there is a verse that says on the Day of Judgment, a group of people will be asked, why didn't you go somewhere else, or why didn't you do anything positive? And their answer is, well, we were living in an environment that we couldn't do much. And then, the question is, we can give this so that the sister would ask the question herself. But this question is that what should be done, or what is the situation with regard to individuals that they find themselves in minority and surrounded by an environment they can't do much about it, if I understood the question correctly. Well, as I said, there are a number of verses in the Holy Quran that talks about this. The fundamental principle is that an active, a dynamic Muslim is supposed to affect the environment, not allow the environment to affect his or her way of life. But to be realistic, sometimes there are times in which we cannot affect the environment. And the environment, whether we like it or we don't, is going to affect us in a negative way. That's the verse, أَلَمْ تَكُنْ أَرْضُ اللَّهِ وَاسِعَةً, concept of hijrah and migration to somewhere else, where you can be more productive. So if we feel that we live in an environment that we would like to carry the mantle forward, and we are conscious of our obligation, but we feel that the environment is negatively affecting us, and we have reached the point of paralysis, literally, we can't do much, then it becomes an obligation to move somewhere else. If we cannot work through collaborative effort to at least create the structure that this will not happen. But if collectively or individually we reach a point where we simply can't do much, the society is corrupting, eroding, changing our culture, etc., then it's the concept of hijrah and migration to somewhere else where the opportunity exists. Remember, at the end of the day, these are the characteristics of any human being. Number one, the perception. Number two, for you to be able to decide. Number three, the implement. We may become paralyzed after the perception. We simply cannot make good choices because of the force of circumstance. Or even when we make good choices, the implementation becomes critical or even problematic. Then this is part of the thing. If there are no other ways of dealing with it, through collaborative effort, through working with other groups, then migration has no other alternative. To go into some other places. أَلَمْ تَكُنْ أَرْضُ اللَّهِ وَاسِعَةً? The question is, well, in one particular location you were paralyzed. What about somewhere else? That should be always part of hijrah and migration because our life, according to the verse in the Quran, has to be movement from dhulumat ila nur, from darkness to light, from material towards Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. if this constant movement is absent, Hadith from Amir al-Mu'mineen says, you are dead. If 2 days in a Muslim's life are equal and there is no improvement, then you are a walking dead. Or one is a walking dead. So this constant movement, bettering one's life and moving from dhulumat, from material towards Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is an obligation. It's for me to assess the conditions that I live in. Can I at least begin by saving my own skin? If that becomes questionable, then there is no other alternative. Because without a thorough understanding who I am and protecting at least my own family, there is no second step going towards social structure or anything else. Normally I ask one question from sisters, one question from brothers. Since I don't see any papers waved by the brothers, I automatically assume that you don't have any question.
صلوات بر محمد و آل محمد.
I really don't understand what is the question.
The question is that every year around Muharram, we see on the internet there are videos of people who are gathering together for Sina Zari. And a lot of these are very bloody and very poor. And of course, there's lots of comments about that. But I just wanted to know what is your opinion on Sina Zari and how do we defend that part of our practice, or is it defensible or not?
Well, this question was asked by a younger brother last night. Remember, one thing you have to bear in mind, sister, that there are actions that are intrinsically prohibited in Islam, haram. But there are actions which are considered to be mubah. That means there is no clear instruction that you shouldn't do it. Intrinsically, they are permissible. But there are externalities or conditions that prevail that even a mubah becomes haram under certain circumstances. Now, with regard to tatbir, for example, hitting one's head with a sword, or bloodying yourself, all the scholars these days have given fatwa that this is not allowed. Even if in principle the action, one might argue that there is nothing prohibitive contextually, but bearing in mind that we are living in an age in which particularly Shia Islam is under attack, and any action that would destroy or disfigure the image of Shia is considered to be non-acceptable. So even those who would argue that, well, from a Sharia perspective, we may not have anything in particular, any hadith or so on, that latmiya sinazani is haram or it is not haram, or zanjir is haram or it's not haram. Once you contextualize it, you put it into this context, the image, the signification of the image, particularly the negative signification of the image, then the scholars have said it's not allowed. The problem is, there are a number of people that no matter what religious edict comes out or opinion that says this is not allowed, because it's cultural one, they're going to do it irrespective of it. There is a story, I remember when I was in Qum many years ago, one Muharram people began coming out. This is what, 1976. People began coming out, men with no shirt or hardly anything. So the first question that we asked as younger junior student, well, this exposure is not acceptable. Women are going around. And one of the scholars that was there, he said, Marhum Burujerdi, this is one of the grand scholars, brought the head of these various groups that they organized, latmiyas, and going out and beating their chest, and instructed them, gave them his opinion that it is haram because of the secondary issues, You may not have any specific order for this, but because you are exposing yourself, which is haram, this is not allowed. The answer was, Maulana, we are your followers in every other day of the year but this day. Some people, I told you, no matter how critical the issue is, it's the culture that has to be done. I remember when a few years ago, I was in London, when a few years ago fatwa came out from Ayatollah Khamenei regarding the tahrim of takbir, Iraqi community members in London started swearing at the Grand Scholar for giving a fatwa that was somehow opposed their cultural behavior. This is unfortunately human failure, part of human failure. There's nothing one could do. My view is the same thing. I wouldn't do it. But can I convince somebody who's up to his eyeballs with this culture? Doubt it. No matter how many papers I bring out, how many hadith I bring out. I've had conversation in Saudi Arabia with some of the scholars regarding this equality of gender. No matter what you bring out as far as hadith, this is how it's been done. That's the excuse. There's nothing you can do. Oh, it's already 9 o'clock. این سوال رو باید صبر کنیم تا آخر خطبه سخنرانی انگلیسی وقتی که گریز میزنم ما بحثی رو در تاریخ نداریم که حضرت به حضرت ابوالفضل اجازه جنگ نداد. تاریخ برخلاف این رو داره میگه. اوکی؟